What's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks for Sports Illustrated over on Fan Nation. Got a big episode of the podcast today. I am super excited, doing something new here. I am bringing on Sam Popper. He's the former director of recruiting strategy at Oregon, and he's now made his way out to Akron on Joe Moorhead's staff as the new director of player personnel, and wanted to bring him on the show to kind of just learn a little about his experience at Oregon and just, get to share his perspective. What's going on, Sam? Thanks for being here.
Dude, Max, thanks for having me on, dude. I'm excited.
Right on, man. Well, I know we've been doing this. We've been this has been in the works for a little bit. So, yeah, man, excited to bring you on and kind of share your story a little bit more with my audience. I know obviously Duck fans love recruiting, and I'm just trying to sink my teeth into that a little bit more. And it's been cool getting to know you and kind of get a little bit of a better look at everything. So for people who don't know you, Sam, I feel like the recruiting staff doesn't really get a lot of shine that they deserve. They don't get the same shine that the on-field guys do. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you ultimately ended up at Oregon.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. And like you said, it's kind of been in the works for a while. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be doing this with you. So my name's Sam Popper. I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland. I got started in recruiting as a student intern at the University of Michigan from 2015 to 2019. I was there as a student intern in recruiting, and then after that, I was the director of recruiting at Howard University, and ended up there for one season. And then after that, that was when I kind of got to Oregon. So I got to Oregon pretty much right as the pandemic was starting, like right at the end of March of 2020, and then shoot, I was there until the end of this past season.
So what was that like for you, man? I mean, making a big shift like that, moving all the way to Eugene during a pandemic, no less.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty big move for you. Just kind of walk us through that transition.
Yeah, well, dude, so it was wild. So, we had a coaching change at Howard University, and I wasn't kept on with the new staff. So, I was looking for a new position. I was kind of talking to some different schools. And when I ended up getting my interview out to Oregon, it's kind of a funny story. Like, my mom was telling me that, I needed to bring all this hand sanitizer when I was going out to Eugene with me because there was some disease out there, which I had never heard of, and my mom, she worries a lot. I love her. She worries a lot. So I was like, all right, Mom, it's all good. So I brought the hand sanitizer over there. And, so when I got there, I interviewed in the beginning of March. And that was actually where Oregon's Pro Day was going to be like the next day. And it was their fourth spring practice of 2020. And that ended up being their last spring practice that they did. And the day that I ended up getting the job on the interview, and so when I flew back, I was pretty excited, thinking, all right, I'm going to move cross country to Oregon here, obviously with no clue kind of how I was going to make that move, expecting to fly and everything like that. And then, my flight went from Eugene to Salt Lake City, back to Dulles in Maryland. And when I landed in Dulles, like that was the day that like COVID went from nothing to something. It's like that was the day, Rudy Gobert was touching all the microphones and, and then like Mark Cuban had that like, video where he was like looking at his phone, talking about how the NBA was canceled. He was like shell shocked, like shows the guy next to him. And it was pretty much all that day. So that day I kind of had to figure out like how the heck I was going to get out there. And, it was when I could have done a cross country flight for about $15, but nobody knew what COVID was. So it was like super unsafe. So I ended up kind of just packing everything in the car and, drove and stopped at some different places. And I had some friends call me on the way and say, sorry, like I can't have you stay here just because I don't know if you're going to get the disease and everything like that, which obviously I understood. But yeah, dude, it was a wild adventure. But then I got there and dude, like, obviously being someone from the East Coast, I'd never been out to the, Pacific Northwest in my life. And dude, Eugene was just the perfect place to be during like a pandemic as the world was so uncertain, everything. So there's so much to do outside. And I was getting there just in the beginning of summer where it's just absolutely beautiful in Eugene. So it was an adventure, but at the end of it, like I was really happy when I got there.
Yeah, Eugene's definitely the place to be. I've lived here for almost 2 years, so I can definitely echo everything that you're saying. Really crazy hearing about, just packing up your bag and hitting the road out to Eugene. I feel like that's kind of the sudden nature of coaching. That's kind of the way things work. I remember, once you got the Akron job, you hit me up. You're like, Max, I'm on the road on the way to Ohio, man.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going out to Akron. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. So
Happens quick.
It really does. It really does. So Sam, when you were during your time at Oregon, a little bit, prior to your arrival, but I feel like your time at Oregon is really, obviously the Mario Cristobal era, part of that era. And, that was a huge, huge shift in Oregon recruiting from what we've seen, prior to that. I'm sure you did all your research before you came out to Oregon. So, about how Willie Taggart, I feel like, really kicked it into high gear. And then Mario just took it, a massive step further. So when you were here at Oregon, what kind of can you kind of just explain the shift that we saw in Oregon recruiting, just from them taking this thing to a whole new level that I feel like people really hadn't seen before?
Yeah, so I will really say on the recruiting front, it's interesting because I feel like a lot of what you see from the outside, especially now kind of with my experience from the inside, it's so hard to determine like truly how a staff recruited kind of from the outside. So I'm not really entirely sure kind of how things happened before Coach Cristobal got there and everything. But in terms of when he was there and in terms of kind of my time with him on the staff, I think, to be honest, one of the things that he emphasized and that I really learned from him, more than anything else was just effort and how to outwork, other programs. And I think if there was one thing that as a staff we could really hang our hats on in recruiting, it was that, we were really out there to outwork teams, and we really dedicated ourselves, our time, and our staff to recruiting. And, I think a lot of people don't realize that within a college football team, there is a heck of a lot to manage, especially from a head coach perspective. And, the time that he invested in recruiting, the time that, everyone in the department, including myself, spent working with him, sometimes even in a one-on-one capacity, it was awesome. And, when the head coach invests so much in recruiting, that has an effect on the position coaches, as they don't want to be the only ones to, not be holding their end of the bargain. So then they invest more time in recruiting. And I just thought we worked really hard at it. I thought we had a pretty good, strategy for how we wanted to identify and how we wanted to evaluate. And our head coach just attacked it. And to be honest with you, I think that's kind of the biggest differentiator out of kind of all the things we did in recruiting that really helped us get a lot of the prospects that we wanted in the boat.
Sam, recruiting's far from a perfect science, as you know, and I know as well. But you talk about effort and how that's such a big part of the equation. And you can really understand, at least from now, like why maybe Dan Lanning wanted to get, a young staff at Oregon, because it sounds like, if you're really dedicated to it, as you saw, the results can really speak for themselves and pay off.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think that a lot of it's relating to prospects, and a lot of it is, being able to communicate well and to recruit. And a lot of it is on the back end, being able to identify, like, what do you want? Like, what is an Oregon Duck? How are we going to evaluate this prospect compared to a lot of other prospects in the country? And, that's one thing that I've kind of heard from people that are still over there that Coach Lanning's staff is doing a really good job of. And so I think they'll be able to continue right where we left off with recruiting. And I think Ducks fans should be optimistic about kind of where they're headed in that sense too.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit before we hit record. I don't want to ask you to give away the secret sauce by any means, but you're giving us some awesome insight into how everything, was when you were there. I wanted to stay on your last point. You said, you think that Lanning and his staff are going to be able to kind of pick up where Mario left off. I think it was 3 top 10 classes are still on the roster from, the time that he was here. How do you think someone would go about kind of keeping that momentum, just from, approaching that recruiting and making it a priority?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think that Oregon's a really easy place to do it, in the sense that a lot of Oregon recruits itself. Like, it's an awesome program. There's a ton that Oregon has to hang its hat on, not only in terms of, tradition and the place that Eugene is. True, I love Eugene. Like, I love living there. I think it's an awesome spot, but everything they have in terms of facilities, in terms of the stadium, in terms of the campus, all that recruits itself. But, I think for them, it's really important that they continue to identify the right guys And I think that's kind of the important part, because it's about kind of recruiting the guys that, you feel are genuinely kind of worth your time in terms of opportunity cost, and there's so many guys that can come in and bring Oregon that can make Oregon better. There's so many guys that are worth recruiting and trying to bring out to Oregon. But, I think they'll do a really good job just based on kind of how they identify and how they evaluate, and, determining who are truly the right guys for us to dive in head first and recruit. And that's kind of a big part in the process too, that, I think they'll do a great job with.
Oregon can sell itself. I like that. I like that, because I think I've kind of seen that from the outside when I'm talking to a lot of these prospects that Oregon's looking at. I think one guy that would be a perfect example is someone I actually brought on this podcast on my YouTube channel, which this interview will be on my YouTube channel at Oregon Football Max Torres. If you guys want to enjoy some of that multi-platform excellence and see me and Sam doing our thing, chopping it up here. But Sir Mells is the guy that I'm talking about. I'm sure you got to meet him. During his time as a recruit, because I remember when he decommitted from Washington, to kind of rewind things a little bit. He was a guy that I felt really good about Oregon's chances with. They just kind of have to get him on campus, and then lo and behold, the felt like never-ending recruiting dead period ended in June, and the Ducks got him on campus, and he committed, right there, kind of on the spot during that visit. Tell me a little bit more about just that energy that you think that the program just kind of inspires, because you have the tradition, but I feel like Oregon's tradition is innovation, and we're seeing it all the time.
Yeah. So Max, when I was in high school, I remember there was a college football game between Oregon and Maryland, and Oregon obviously being Nike, and Maryland obviously being Under Armour. They were both going to pretty much just like flex these awesome jerseys at each other. And it was supposed to be like this game of the jerseys. I couldn't tell you what year it was. I graduated high school in 2015. I got there in 2011. So at some point in that range. And that was when Maryland like debuted those, like basically taking the state flag and like wrapping themselves in some football pads and like that being their jersey. That was like when they debuted that. And I remember looking at Oregon's jerseys that day, like, God, Oregon, those jerseys look awesome. That's so cool. And it's interesting to think, like, part of the reason why I've really enjoyed recruiting, as I've kind of gotten into it, and, I won't be able to say this forever, but like, I'm not that much older than a lot of these other guys. I'm 25 years old, and so I think about me being at that point in high school, like a lot of these recruits at that point were probably in elementary school, middle school. Like they probably remember that stuff just like I did as a kid, and so like there's an era of Oregon football that was awesome when I was growing up that, these recruits probably experienced as well. And that was kind of a real sense that I got, recruiting at Oregon, that I didn't really have to explain much of kind of what the tradition of the program was, because these kids, for the most part, already knew about it. Adding in kind of the Nike side of it, and, they've done a great job incorporating what Nike does, not only from just like a swag platform, obviously, but like from a, career building platform and resume building and job experience and all the stuff you want to add into, NIL and all that good stuff, like they've brought on Nike in a lot of different ways, and they really capitalized on kids loving Nike and what Nike is from a like swag platform, which, by the way, Kenny Farr does an amazing job of doing all that stuff in EQ. I had to give him a shout out. But like all this stuff in terms of job placement and experience and things that guys can get to help them in the professional world when they're done at Oregon. I thought the school did a great job at capitalizing on that. And I thought from a recruiting staff perspective, it was really our job to take those resources and see how we could heighten that awareness with prospects and ways that we could distribute that information to them. Because for the most part, the university and the people within it were really taking care of that as a whole, which is awesome. And I think that, if Oregon was the first place that I had been, I probably would have taken that for granted a little bit, because not every school kind of like has that in the bag prepared and ready to distribute to prospects like Oregon did. And you kind of talked about the energy. I mean, I just thought that those two aspects were huge as far as like why kids already were so into Oregon, from kind of really just like the beginning of the recruiting process.
Wow, so much good stuff in that answer. I'm trying to kind of digest where I want to go with this next part, but I really liked what you talked about, the history of Oregon, and I feel like everything you just said in that last part of your answer is like part of the reason why Oregon's just an immediate contender for a lot of guys once they get that offer. I think there's definitely some more like extra work to be done, in the southeastern part of the country. I've been talking to some guys from Alabama that get that offer, and they're saying I was kind of surprised because a lot of people, out here haven't really gotten that Oregon offer. They haven't gone there in the past. But what you talked about with the Nike connection is really well said. And I think that it kind of just puts it into perspective why Oregon is one of really a handful of schools, I'd really say in the upper echelon, that are ready to capitalize on this NIL era of college athletics. And it extends far beyond just football. So I really liked that perspective that you added there. You mentioned the Oregon Maryland game. Being somebody that's kind of from that neck of the woods, what are your honest takes on the Maryland Terps uniforms that we're seeing these days?
I think it's a lot. I really do. I think it's a lot. To be honest with you, I think that's kind of one of the cool things about Nike is like they take something that's simple and they just in some way, shape, or form, they just inject a lot of swag in it. And I feel like a lot of other, kind of companies sometimes have to like, I'm not trying to talk down on anybody or anything, but I feel like a lot of other companies, they have to like make things complex to make them look cool or like add different things, whereas Nike really doesn't. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about Oregon's uniform. They just make things really basic and all that. And hey, I'm a lover of the Maryland state flag. I think it's awesome. I love Old Bay. Like I'm a Maryland dude. I just think it's a lot for a football jersey. The flag. I think it's a lot for a football jersey.
Right on. Okay, cool to get your opinion, being someone who has a much closer association than myself, obviously being a West Coast guy. Kind of a big picture question that isn't so much focused on recruiting, but rather, the Oregon program as a whole. You talked about how people, they grow up, like in Oregon, they watch Oregon, they played as Oregon in NCAA football. Hopefully we can get a new game soon, just quick side note.
Absolutely.
But I feel like as great as all that is, it's time for Oregon to take that next step as far as on field, because we saw them beat Ohio State. We've seen them win Rose Bowls and they made that inaugural playoff. But I think that I feel like if I'm an Oregon fan, I want some of these recruits to be saying, "Oh yeah, I was watching Ty Thompson just lead a game-winning drive, or Troy Franklin make a crazy game-winning catch, or Noah Sewell just throwing the quarterback around." Like it's time for Oregon to do something significant enough. I feel like to have recruits, be talking about the here and now much more, because I feel like when I have those recruiting conversations with these guys, a lot of it kind of seems rooted in the past, which isn't bad. That's not going to hurt Oregon's chances with anybody. But I feel like, especially with Dan Lanning and the way that they've recruited, it's time for them to really make that next push. And I think that the playoffs, at least making a playoff appearance is that next step.
No, definitely. I mean, when you talk about the here and now, it's interesting because, from our perspective in recruiting, a lot of time we don't really see the fruits of our labor for a couple years into the future, right? Like, because you get, somebody will pat you on the back for signing a class that's ranked a certain way. But like, obviously, usually those guys don't get on the field for around 2.5 years down the road in terms of like the majority of the class, and affecting wins and losses. And, when you kind of think about what recruiting at Oregon can be to get to that point, I think that's kind of what we focused on a lot during my time at Oregon was we wanted to recruit national because we could. Because we had the staff, because we worked really hard at it, and because we had, a good strategy for identifying and evaluating prospects. But, I think that the important part of that is, when you recruit in areas that are normally tough for Oregon to recruit in, making sure you have a real targeted approach so that, you can get the prospects that you want. I think that's sometimes a key, because you're never going to get to that point unless you physically get yourself there. And it's really hard to sell yourself on something that is in the future when it's not necessarily in the present, So as far as getting to the playoff and, everything like that, I think Oregon has a lot of the talent that can definitely get them there. But, one thing I'd probably say if I was still working there was that, it's really important that when you're going to target that the Southeast and areas that may be a little bit more difficult in recruiting, make sure you have a real targeted approach. Why are we recruiting this guy, and what's going to be the thing that pushes us over the edge? Because, you can't act like something that you haven't gotten to yet. And sometimes in that area, you may be recruiting against teams where Coach Lanning was previously, that, genuinely has college football playoff to their resume in the last couple of years. And, just because you don't have it, that's okay. That's obviously you're going to get there down the road, and kids are going to a place because of where they can be in 3 to 4 years. But just making sure that you have a targeted approach on, what is it going to be with us for this guy? And then you dive in head first. And, that's kind of the great thing about Oregon is regardless of all that, once Oregon dives in head first, there's nothing that Oregon can't do. And that was a really awesome part about being there.
Yeah, there's nothing that Oregon can't do once they dive in head first. I feel like that's kind of a mantra or mentality that has really carried over between Cristobal and Lanning. Lanning said as much in his introductory press conference. I believe he was saying, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to get anybody in the country. And
no
I
reason
also,
at all.
Yeah, and I liked what you said about playoff history isn't necessarily everything, because I feel like a lot of these guys they want to get to the NFL. That's a huge part of the equation for so many of them. But when you mentioned recruiting nationally, Sam, I think Oregon finds himself in a unique situation, because when you look at some of these schools that are in the upper tiers of the sport, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Ohio States, those guys to a large extent have a lot of really elite talent in their backyard, and Oregon isn't in that situation. I feel like Washington and Seattle and the Pacific Northwest specifically, like that, they've really been upping their production of high level college football players. Oregon, I can't forget about them. They have some pretty good players every now and then, but not really consistently at that level that you really need to be competitive, which is why I feel like they set up shop in California. But that was a really long-winded way of saying that Oregon needs to recruit nationally, and it feels like they're capitalizing on that. I know that one thing we talked about when you were still at Oregon was a couple guys, specifically Kelvin Banks and TJ Dudley. Not to hash old wounds with Oregon fans, since both of them ended up committing elsewhere. Those are two really high profile guys that Oregon really hasn't seen themselves getting in recent years. So obviously they were committed at some point, but I remember when we were talking about them, you said they were kind of guys Oregon really didn't have any business getting. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I love those two guys. From a play, from just how they were on the field, and from a character perspective, like great people, both have great families. I think that both those guys will do great in college, and it's fun. So I don't mean to kind of do the whole hash old wounds either, but like when you recruit those guys and you get to know them and their families for a long time, like, to be honest with you, it's really hard not to root for them wherever they go, even though you do wish they might have been in a different place. So, but to your point, Max, that kind of goes to kind of what I was saying with the targeted approach. Both those guys are examples where, above all else, we had two position coaches, Coach Wilson and Coach Mirabal, that, really are just good recruiters. They get on the ground, and both of them are really good, really easy to relate to. And both of them work their rear ends off in recruiting. And, that helped us. That was the biggest driver. But we identified those guys really early. We knew we wanted to recruit them really early. We knew they were priorities. Those position coaches did a great job. And so did a lot of us on staff of, getting to know a lot more about those two guys, a lot more about why they would be into the West Coast, why Oregon would be a really good fit for them. Like for Kelvin, for example, he loved the outdoors. Like he loved doing stuff in nature. Like his parents were looking for different places where they could spend summers and, things like that. And, Eugene had so much that Kelvin wanted from, not only kind of on field and football scheme fit and philosophy and all that type of stuff, and an O-lineman as the head coach. I mean, how awesome is that for somebody, that loves to just get downhill and run the ball and block and all that type of stuff. And, but Eugene was a place that was a perfect fit for him, and TJ, Coach Wilson had been recruiting TJ for, almost 2 years, prior to kind of us being able to get him in the boat. And, he's the type of guy who his family has a bunch of roots in Michigan. They weren't necessarily tied into the South. He had people that had been all over. And at the end of the day, he wanted to go to a place where, he could play early and he could have a really prominent role in the defense. And that was something we had been showing him for about 18 months. Not to mention, he also finally got to Eugene and loved the area. And he had talked about the idea of, shoot, I may get drafted anywhere in the NFL. I don't want to be tied into a specific area in recruiting. So, not to get too much into those two guys specifically, but those are some areas where, we feel like we have a really good chance at those guys because we already know information on the back end that would tailor them to be fits in Eugene, to the point where it was completely worth it to like dive in head first and go after both those guys. And, spent a lot of time with both those guys on their visits, our staff did. And we felt like we did a good job there. And it was because it was because we identified those guys early. It was because we evaluated them. We knew how the position coaches saw those guys. We gathered information on those guys early in the recruiting process. And from there, we knew it was worth our time to dive in head first. So, we did, with no regrets either way. And that's, to me, a lot of kind of philosophically what college football recruiting is, and especially at a place like Oregon, where you really have to recruit more national, is, what's worth it and why? Because you need to ask a lot of those questions before you start to kind of dive in head first, because, if we had spread ourselves too thin, it would have been hard to get, TJ and Kelvin in the boat. But like, we knew those two guys were like perfect fits. And at the end of the day, we ended up kind of, both those guys on offense and defense did a great job in helping us build the rest of the class around those guys. Because then we could sit here and look at defensive players and say, well, shoot, you're in said situation. Look at TJ Dudley. He came over here from Alabama. Like, he'll be a great player for us. And, we could say the same thing for Kelvin Banks in his school in Houston that, most of those kids predominantly go to Texas. And historically, Oregon has not been able to get those prospects. But when you're going national and you have a process that allows you to identify and evaluate early, sometimes that puts you in a great position. You combine that with the secret sauce of two position coaches that were just really awesome at what they did and were just great people. I mean, that's how you can do it.
It's wild to think that there's really, like one or two things or factors, if you want to call it, in a given prospect's recruitment that you really need to latch onto, and that can, be the difference. And you kind of just have to keep chipping away at it, literally over a year, like you talked about, 18 months, that can really be the difference maker in the recruitment. I remember I talked to both Kelvin and TJ during their times as recruits. Kelvin's going to Texas and TJ's ended up at Clemson. And I remember what you were talking about with the outdoors with Kelvin. He talked about that. He talked also about, when he was at Oklahoma State in Stillwater, he kind of got some of that outdoorsy feel. So it's interesting to hear that, because I think one of the biggest things that surprises me about Oregon, especially after, actually moving out to Eugene and living here, is it's really world-class athletics. You feel like I feel like at times, I'm looking at places like the Hatfield-Dowling complex where I go for pressers, and Hayward Field, and it feels like it's almost like an Olympic Village type of deal, like super high scale facilities and everything. And you're in Western Oregon, small town Eugene, and all this stuff's going on.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, like, and then TJ too, like, Oregon was always like, you talk about like Oregon being his, dream school, and he was being a fan and all that when he was a kid. And I remember like he got to campus and he was like, just seeing the facility, like you could just see kind of this like awesome smile on his face. And it makes you think sometimes like, yeah, we're in a pretty cool spot over here, and dude, I got so many like, pictures on my phone of like, sunsets just looking out of the window of the facility, like or sunrises like right over the stadium. And it's like, just do like how green Oregon was, like that's something that I won't forget about Eugene. Like it was awesome. And, I think that's kind of one of the cool things about it. It's almost like a mystery to people that are, not from the areas. They don't really know what to necessarily expect when they get to Eugene. So they get there, they see how green it is, they see how beautiful it is, and they're like, oh, it's a cool spot. I'm like, I mean, shoot, dude, like the stadium in Eugene has like a waterfall on the side of it, facing the facility. Like, what other stadium in the country that can seat 60,000 people have a waterfall out of the side, and out of the back of the stadium? Like that's, it's just unique. It's really cool. And I think as a whole, that's a lot of what Eugene, Oregon is.
I can say from firsthand experience, it's not easy to get to and from Eugene. It really isn't from a travel standpoint.
Yeah.
But man, once you get out here, man, that's like what we were saying earlier with Sir Mel, is like, once you get out here, you see why it's so special and why they've been able to accomplish what they have been from an athletic standpoint.
Yeah, dude, that was our big STEMO in recruiting. Get them out to campus. There's no chance till you get them out to you gotta get them out to campus. They got to see it because I think it's a cool thing to see.
Someone can say that, Oregon's my dream school as much as you want, but when it kind of comes down, push comes to shove, I'm like writing up these stories on, maybe Oregon's chances of the guy. I'm like, well, did he get on campus? He didn't. Okay, then I can't really give him that much of a chance. But that actually brings up a really interesting point, Sam. Since you came over during the pandemic, a lot of that 2021 class committed sight unseen because they literally couldn't get out to campus. Can you just talk about what it was like, that the challenges that, obviously you had to overcome when you were recruiting during a pandemic and you weren't able to get anybody out here?
Yeah, it was a different world. To be honest with you, it was really a different world. So when I started at Oregon Max, well, I was assistant director of recruiting and I worked with the offense, really kind of on the side of identification, evaluation. And in that 2021 class that we had on offense, we were
Loaded.
We're it was a great class. It was a great class. We were fortunate in the side of we had a lot of guys who had been to campus before, and we're like we had end up having some guys come to campus to see it before, but we also had a lot of guys that didn't. Like Ty Thompson got to Oregon like right as I was getting there, like right before the pandemic happened and visits were cut down. That was a huge differentiator for us, and yet we were also at a position where like Isaiah Brevard is a guy that comes to mind. Like he hadn't been to campus yet, and through the process of recruiting him, it was, Coach Moorhead and Coach McClendon both did an awesome job, and both of them had great relationships with him that really, really helped. And I think it kind of for him was on the side of people that he felt comfortable with, and like, we would contact Isaiah and we would call him and get him on FaceTime pretty much every day, sometimes twice a day. And like, I think that for him, it was a matter of like, we just had to make him feel comfortable with everything that was going to be around him here and not dodge the fact that he hadn't been here yet, because I think if we may have dodged the fact that he hadn't been there and maybe tried to present Eugene as maybe something that he wouldn't interpret it as, like, that's kind of part of recruiting, right? Like that's why so many guys go in the portal, is if they expect one thing in a school and then they get there and it's something else. Like that's what we didn't want with Isaiah. So we were really open in the fact like, hey, like you haven't been here, this and that, and I think he just felt comfortable with the people that were going to be around him. We had Troy and Dante in that class as well from a receiver perspective. Both of them had been to campus, so they were able to kind of talk him through the process of coming to campus and what it was like. We had Seven McGee, who, Coach Master always joke around with me in my first month on the job that Seven had been to campus more than I had, because he had come all the time, I'd been committed for a long time. And, he was able to kind of talk Isaiah a little bit through kind of what campus was going to be and all that stuff. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a team effort. You can't dodge the fact that he hadn't been to campus, but you also have to like just put a lot of people around him in a lot of different areas outside of just coaches where, that person's going to be comfortable coming there. And even if Eugene is just a little bit different than what he expects, he still feels comfortable in the group of people that's around him and the plan that you have in place for him. So that was kind of our plan with a guy like Isaiah. I'm just kind of using him as the example because, I was just involved in that one that, he hadn't been to Eugene for a kid from Mississippi that, we're just kind of able to sign and, and shoot, he's going to be a great player in Eugene, like a lot of those guys in that class.
Brevard's a guy that I think kind of gets a little bit forgotten in the conversation, especially about the receivers heading into next year. We got spring ball starting up here this week in Eugene. I think that wide receiver room is going to look a lot different, but, can't forget that he was an All-American coming out of high school. So, he's going to be someone that figures to compete in that wide receiver room. When you talk about recruiting during a pandemic, I feel like that just hammers home the point even more that recruiting is really a game that's all about effort, because when you can't get people out here, really all you have is your phone. I mean, your screen time must have been through the roof.
Yeah, 100%. And like, you got to get creative and like showing them what campus is without them being here. Like Terrence Ferguson was like another example. Like, we did everything with him on Zoom. And shoot, you can get him on the show and ask him. I'm sure him and his parents were like, we literally did everything with them on Zoom. Everything that you would do pretty much during an official visit, besides like eating food in front of their faces, like we did with them on Zoom. And I'm sure that if you had T. Ferg on the show, he would say at a certain point, like, he got just tired of doing everything on Zoom. But we had to show him exactly what he was getting into in Eugene. And so many presentations that we did with him and them on Zoom. And, bringing him and his parents on for like a virtual facility tour. And, I'd like kind of show them like a, little map of campus, like again, all virtual, but like, yeah, you got to do it. Like you just got to do it. Like there's no way around it. And, it was different too, because like the majority of the country wasn't working like that, like the majority of the country wasn't working like that. Now in Colorado, I don't think schools were, but I mean, the South and most of the East Coast, like, shoot, even some places in the Big Ten, like that was how schools were operating, as you couldn't do a visit, but you could go for a game, like you could sit in the stands for a game, and you couldn't out here. So like we just had to be creative in how we were going to kind of show them campus and everything like that.
Man, that's crazy just to think about all the different challenges that kind of came with that. Thank God for all the technology that we have at our disposal. That's how we're doing this, podcast right now. You're all the way out there in Ohio, which is just crazy to me. I mean, I was talking to
you should. So I was just gonna say you should have seen like our Zoom schedule, like when we were really like working in the heyday of the spring of 2020. Like we had this little schedule on Zoom. I mean, it was unbelievable. Like it was really like it was full. And with some of those guys, I promise you, you get them on the show, and they would just like get almost just so annoyed just talking about how many like different Zooms they did and different stuff like that. So yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot, and like obviously the world knows about Zoom now.
So given how hard it was to recruit during the pandemic, how did you guys as a staff feel once you inked that 2021 class, and were you finally able to take a sigh of relief a little bit, or was it hey, right on to 2022?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think sigh was made for I don't know, about 24 hours, and we're on to it. I think you spent so much time in 21, and for us on kind of when I was doing stuff with the offensive side of the ball primarily. I mean, we had a lot of that 21 class kind of locked down pretty early on in the cycle, and that allowed us to like really get a good early jump start on 2022. So to be honest with you, there really wasn't that point ever like signing day. You take 24 hours, you kind of like take a couple deep breaths, because obviously you're waking up pretty early in the morning to get those guys inked up and get their NLIs in and everything like that. But I think you ask a lot of those position coaches, and the work that we kind of did behind the scenes in that aspect. I mean, we had a lot of that class locked down, kind of early on in the 2020 football season, and again, we were really in on 2022 as far as early identification and evaluation far before we ended up signing that. So to be honest with you, I guess what I'm trying to say is it really didn't feel like much of a transition. We were already kind of just dove in head first, and already a good amount of kind of targeted 22s.
A quick 24-hour celebration, window. Sounds like, Sam. We're coming up on 40 minutes here, so I think maybe I'm thinking like 10-ish more minutes. I know
however long you want to go, dude.
Didn't have it. I mean, I could talk to you like the entire day about recruiting, because I love it. One of the questions that I wanted to kind of circle back on, since we were talking about that transition between classes. Obviously, Oregon's 2022 class took a massive hit once Cristobal decided to go to Miami, and that was to be expected. But during the season before that happened, my kind of thought process was, okay, this 2022 class looks great, but a lot of these blue blood programs, high level programs, they're already pushing ahead to 23. And, now obviously this is going to be the first cycle in 2023 where we get to really see what Dan Lanning and the staff can do. With recruiting being such a, future based, thing, how do you kind of manage, or I guess gauge how important it is to focus on the here and now? So the 2023 class now for guys at Oregon, and then you at Akron, but also making some headway into even the next class.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say from that side of it, you take what you're given, I mean, and at the end of the day for Coach Lanning and his staff, I mean, they get there to start, I think, Georgia won the national championship on like January 10th or whatever. So I assume his first day was January 11th, Yeah, obviously, I mean, it's a late start on 2023 compared to some programs, but I mean, what can you do about it, So they take what they're given, and, they just start to hit the ground running as soon as they get there. And, so for that side of it, I think that it's important to focus on the here and now, because, that's what's right in front of you, and those are the cards you're dealt, and you make the best of it and you keep going. But, it is important to dive in and get early identification and early evaluation done in the class of 2024. And, I think for the group that they have, it could be a pretty simultaneous process in terms of getting ahead with the next class and recruiting the class that's right in front of you. So I don't think it's too much of an issue for them and what they're doing. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's kind of what recruiting is. You make the best of the situation that's put in front of you, and I'm sure that's what they're doing with that situation.
Okay. I have a kind of a cool big picture question that I've been thinking about a lot, and it doesn't have necessarily a lot to do with Oregon. So kind of going into a little bit different waters. Have you ever listened to or heard of the Late Kick podcast with Josh Pate?
I've seen some videos of it, but to be honest with you, I haven't really kind of watched the full episode of it.
Okay, well, you definitely need to check it out. That's probably like my favorite national recruiting podcast, or sorry, just college football podcast. But one of his points that I really have taken a lot of interest in, he's like vehemently opposed to expanding the playoff. And I'm not going to ask you about the college football playoff, but kind of like a lot of his reasoning, I feel like, and his kind of thought process is to kind of restore some more balance to the sport and not just have some of the same teams, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson, just squarely in that conversation for the national championship all the time. I think Josh's point is really cool from a recruiting perspective. It's keeping a lot of the in-state talent home. And you look at the top three most talent-rich states in the country. We got California, Texas, and Florida. Oregon's obviously got a lot of experience in California. That's, the basis for a lot of their classes. Texas was the foundation of that 2022 class for the longest time for Oregon. But I've long held the belief that Oregon needs to get back into Florida, which is, not an easy thing to do, seeing how far Oregon is obviously located from there. So I kind of just wanted to get some of your thoughts on, keeping some of the top talent at home, because you got Lincoln Riley at USC, and LA is just loaded every year. You got Jimbo in College Station and Sark at Austin, out there in Austin with the Longhorns. And then there's just a really big shift, I feel like, that we're going to see. We've probably already started to see in the state of Florida with, two new staffs, with Mario Cristobal taking over at Miami, as we all know, and then Billy Napier at Florida. I feel like if they can keep some of those top talents home, it would be a really interesting and probably different version of the college football that we've seen these past couple of years. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that in terms of kind of strategy with a recruiting staff, I think, to be honest, a lot of it is just working toward your strengths. Like, in my time now coming to the University of Akron with a different staff and a different landscape and, different pool of prospects that we're recruiting, in terms of a lot of philosophical kind of aspects to it, a lot of it, doesn't change. The blueprint is the blueprint. And what our goal is to do is to put our staff in the best position to recruit. And so, to be honest with you, I think what a lot of it is just kind of putting your staff at their strengths. Like, where is your staff at their best recruiting, right? And at the end of the day, the head coach is going to hire the coaching staff. That's not my business, but my business is to take the coaching staff that he hires and what strategy for us puts them at their best. Where do we allow them to most succeed? And at the end of the day, to be honest with you, however, in my opinion, the college football playoff expands or doesn't expand, I think that's still going to kind of be the strategy of recruiting. I think for a lot of the teams that really do it well is they're going to recruit to their staff strengths. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the MO, at least in terms of how I see recruiting is. The end of the day, as a recruiting department, right? Like, you are throwing up the alley so that your coaching staff can oop it down, if that kind of makes sense. Like, it's your job to set them up and put them in the best positions to succeed the same way that they would do that for their players schematically on the football field, right? And, I don't kind of consider that to be something that's really going to change it much as far as recruiting strategy. I don't.
Okay. Yeah, I like that perspective. Just it kind of reminds me of what you were saying earlier about just, making the best with kind of the hand that you're dealt. Sam, you've obviously had some really cool stops during your football career. I think I was doing a little bit of lurking, and I saw a video of you on the Michigan show talking about, some of your, time there, which was really cool. But now that you're at Akron and you've been able to have some stops like Michigan, like Howard, and now Oregon, which I think we can agree is, probably the biggest name on your resume. What are some of the lessons that you think you've taken with you from your time at Oregon that you're going to kind of try to apply moving forward?
Yeah, a ton. I learned we had an awesome staff at Oregon. I can genuinely say I learned a lot from each and every position coach and the head coach especially. But to be honest with you, really kind of what I talked about the jump in terms of what I thought Oregon did best was, I feel like Coach Cristobal taught me more than anything else how to recruit, like how to out recruit somebody, how to put in more effort than the program next to you, like how to show a prospect that you prioritize them more than someone else, and I felt like that was a huge thing of how I learned at Oregon. I mean, I consider when I think of the recruiting process, Max, like I almost put it in 3 steps, and the first step is identification, evaluation, organization, right? Like identifying who you want, how are we going to evaluate them, and then how do we organize those recruits, right? Pre and post evaluation. The second step being gathering of information and following the progression. So like following their high school career in football and other sports, gathering information on their background, them and their family, seeing why they're a fit. And then the third step is like on-campus recruiting on the road, and just winning a recruiting battle. And I think in a lot of steps you can, if you dominate step 3, you can win regardless. And if you don't dominate step 3, you better do a good job at step 1 and step 2. And Oregon really taught me step 3. Like Coach Cristobal is really, really good at just getting out there and recruiting people. And he out-recruited a lot of other head coaches during my time at Oregon. And, as I go to Akron now, and, we have, fewer resources, obviously, than what we did at Oregon. But a lot of the concepts and a lot of the things I learned from Coach Cristobal in terms of, how you can put a lot of effort into recruiting somebody, how you can maximize your time in terms of recruiting. A lot of that stuff, we're going to use at Akron, and hopefully it'll benefit us. I learned a ton from that place. I really did.
I know I'm going to have my eye on the Akron program and how you guys are doing with recruiting, just obviously because I know you. And then, the other Oregon guys, Winston's over there. He followed you guys to Akron. Sam, we've covered so much in this podcast. I know podcast, like being on a podcast, is a little bit of a newer thing to you.
This is my very first one.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that this could be the first one, Ducks Dish. But is there anything that you kind of wanted to add that, or maybe something that we didn't get to talk about as much as you were thinking? whether it be about recruiting, about your time at Oregon, or just football in general.
No, honestly, not that I could think of. I think we've covered a good amount. I mean, I'm, I'll always kind of talk off the air kind of about just like my career and things like that. And each step of it, I could talk about it for a long time, but, I've really kind of grown to like the recruiting process and kind of everything that goes into it. It was something that kind of before I got into it, I really didn't, know anything about. And, it's been a really fun journey kind of learning about it and, almost kind of watching myself try to just continuously learn from people and continuously get better. And the connections that I made at Oregon and everything I feel like I learned at Oregon, like I feel really thankful for kind of where I feel like it kind of positioned me career wise. And there's a ton of assistant coaches at Oregon, obviously now that are all at other places that I know have connections for life with, and it's a really cool feeling. So I really like the place. I really like the people, and I feel really thankful for kind of what I was able to get out of it. And I hope that I was able to kind of put into it something that can hopefully help the program long term.
That's awesome. I've really enjoyed, getting to hear a little bit more about your story. The Sam Popper Oregon Chronicles. Maybe that'd be a cool episode title. I'm going to brainstorm a little bit. But hey, if you guys want to lock in with Sam, you can find him on Twitter at @SamPopper_. He's doing big things over there at Akron. You talked about recruits that you're going to be rooting for, regardless of where they end up. I know I'm going to be rooting for you and your successes, Sam, just because it's been awesome getting to know you a little bit more, since I got out here to Eugene and started to get to know the staff a little bit. But if you guys want to find more of me, you can find me on Twitter at @mtorresports. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel at Oregon Football Max Torres. Really appreciate the support there. And you can also find the Ducks Dish podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Throw us a 5-star review. We really appreciate it. We're always trying to improve. I'm trying to bring on awesome guests like Sam and other recruits that we've seen here. But I don't want to ramble on too much. Got to make sure to shout out Ducks Digest. Go find more Oregon content over there, ducksdigest.com. But that's all we got for this one, you guys. Thank you for tuning in. Huge thank you to Sam for coming on and giving us so much of his valuable time. Make sure you guys stay locked in, and we will see you in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you, guys. Go Ducks.